the Rosary of Silence. In a monastery hidden among the mountains, where the wind whispered ancient teachings and the rivers sang with a serene voice, lived the Zen Master Kaito. He spoke no more than necessary and taught with silence. One day, a young man named Renji arrived, seeking answers. He had read many sacred texts and debated with great sages, but his heart remained restless. "Master," Renji said, bowing, "I have come to learn the deepest truth. I have sought enlightenment in words and thoughts, but I only find emptiness." Kaito nodded without answering. He stood up, took a string with small wooden beads, and handed it to Renji. "This is your path," he said finally. "If you wish to understand, repeat each bead with gratitude." Renji observed the string, feeling its rustic texture and the light weight of each bead. He did not understand how something so simple could contain the truth he sought. "Master, this is nothing more than a thread with beads." Kaito smiled patiently. "Then begin with the first bead." Without further explanation, the master closed his eyes and sank into contemplation. Renji, still confused, held the first bead between his fingers and waited. The wind continued to blow. The mountain remained silent, and in that silence, Renji felt that his journey was just beginning. Renji sat before Master Kaito, holding the rosary in his hands. The beads seemed inert, but the silence around him vibrated with hidden meaning. "Master," he said after a long while, "what should I do with this?" Kaito slowly opened his eyes and pointed to the horizon. "Each bead is a step. Each step is a breath. Each breath is a prayer." Renji frowned. "But there are no words." "Words are like leaves in the wind," Kaito replied. "They come and go, but the root of the tree remains. Do not seek meaning in words, but in the presence of each bead in your fingers." The young man took a deep breath and slid the first bead between his fingers. He didn't know what to say. Perhaps there was nothing to say. He simply breathed. He moved to the second bead. The world remained the same, but something inside him quieted. He moved to the third. The sound of the trees became clearer. He moved to the fourth. The weight of his thoughts became lighter. Kaito smiled and closed his eyes again. Renji continued, unhurried. For the first time in his life, he felt that silence was speaking to him. The mountain breeze caressed Renji's face as he slid one bead after another between his fingers. He did not utter words, but his breath became deeper, more mindful. "Master," he whispered after a while, "I still do not understand." Kaito took a small clay bowl and filled it with water from a nearby stream. Then, with one finger, he touched the surface. The ripples slowly expanded, one after another, until they disappeared at the edges of the bowl. "Each bead you touch is like this movement," said the master. "You do not need to see the center of it all to feel its effects." Renji gazed at the water and returned to his rosary. He slid another bead, then another. With each movement, he noticed something new. The sound of insects, the cadence of the wind, the murmur of his own heart. "And what happens when I reach the last bead?" he asked. Kaito smiled with the serenity of one who already knows the answer. "When you reach the end, you return to the beginning." Renji let out a soft laugh. For the first time, his mind did not rush to seek more answers. He simply returned to the next bead and continued. The sun began to slowly descend behind the mountains, painting the sky in golden and orange hues. Renji kept sliding between the beads, feeling in each one a rhythm, a pause, a moment suspended in time. Kaito, observing him in silence, took a handful of sand and let it fall slowly through his fingers. "Renji," he said in a serene voice, "what remains when the sand is gone?" The young man looked at his empty hand. "Nothing, master." Kaito shook his head. "The space is still there. The hand is still there. Only what was unnecessary has disappeared. Renji lowered his gaze to his rosary. Something inside him stirred. With each bead that passed, with each breath he took, he left behind a part of himself. The rush, the anxiety, the need to understand everything. He slid another bead. He felt lighter. He moved to the next. The murmur of his thoughts dissipated. The wind blew, moving the leaves of the trees. Renji lifted his gaze and, for the first time in a long time, simply listened without judging, without analyzing, without seeking a hidden meaning. He smiled faintly. "Master, is this the purpose of the rosary?" Kaito nodded. "It is not the rosary that has a purpose, but the one who holds it." Renji slid another bead and, without realizing it, his heart began to pray in the silence. Night fell over the mountain, covering it with a mantle of stars. Renji remained there, sitting in stillness, with the rosary in his hands. Something inside him had changed, although he couldn't explain it. Master Kaito stood up and stoked the fire that gently burned in the center of the courtyard. The flames danced with the wind, casting shadows on the stones. "Renji," said Kaito, looking at the fire. "What do you see?" Renji observed in silence before responding. "I see the wood burning. I see the light and the shadows. I see the movement of the air." Kaito took a stick and stirred the embers further. "And what will happen when the wood is gone?" Renji lowered his gaze. "The fire will go out." Kaito shook his head. "The fire does not die. It only returns to its origin." Renji frowned, trying to understand. "So it is with prayer," continued the master. "It is not something that is born and dies, but something that has always been there, waiting to be rekindled." Renji slid another bead between his fingers and closed his eyes. He felt his breath, the warmth of the fire, the vastness of the night. He understood that the rosary was not just a tool, nor a simple act of repetition. It was a return to the essential. He squeezed the next bead with more devotion and let the silence speak for him. The night breeze gently swept through the mountain, carrying with it the murmur of the trees and the scent of incense burning in a corner of the temple. Renji continued with his rosary, each bead slipping through his fingers like drops in an eternal river. Master Kaito remained by his side, in silence, as if his very presence were part of the teaching. Suddenly, Renji felt a restlessness within him. "Master, if prayer is a return, where am I returning to?" Kaito took an empty clay vessel and placed it before Renji. "Fill it with water," he ordered. Renji obeyed and went to the nearby stream. He took the water in the vessel and brought it back. Kaito nodded, then with a sudden movement, poured the contents onto the ground. "Fill it again," he said. Renji, though confused, obeyed again. When he returned, Kaito repeated the same gesture, emptying it completely. "How many times can I do this, Renji?" The young man looked at the vessel and then at the stream. "As many times as you wish, as long as there is water in the stream." Kaito smiled. "That's prayer. It is not a path with a final destination, but a coming and going, an emptying and refilling. The rosary does not take you to a new place. It only reminds you of who you are with each bead you touch." Renji looked at his rosary and held it with more reverence. For the first time, he felt that it was not him holding the beads, but the beads holding him. In the deep silence of the night, he slid another bead and continued. The moon rose high, illuminating the monastery courtyard with its silvery light. Renji remained in his place, the rosary between his fingers, but now something inside him was different. Each bead he touched was no longer just an object. It was a moment, a breath, a silent truth. Master Kaito broke the silence with an unexpected question. "Renji, What are you searching for? The young man blinked, surprised. For years, he had searched for answers, meaning, enlightenment. Now, however, his mind was calm. He looked at his rosary and replied in a serene voice, "Nothing, Master." Kaito smiled and nodded. "Then, you have finally found something." The wind blew through the trees, and Renji felt the echo of those words in his heart. For so long, he had believed that prayer was an effort, a search, a request. But now he understood prayer was not a means to reach something. It was the act of being present. He passed another bead. The world remained the same, but his heart was at peace. Master Kaito stood up and looked at the stars. "Now that you have stopped searching, you can begin to see." Renji slid the next bead, unhurried. The silence was no longer an emptiness. It was his home. The echo of the monastery bell resonated in the night, marking the hour when the monks retired to rest. Renji, however, remained seated, the rosary still between his fingers. Master Kaito observed the young man for a moment before speaking. "Renji, how do you feel now?" The disciple slid another bead before replying, "Nothing, Master." And at the same time, everything. Kaito nodded with satisfaction. "When you began, you sought answers in words. Now you find them in silence." Renji looked at the rosary in his hands. At first, each bead had been just an object, but now, each bead was a moment, a breath, an open door to the present. "The rosary does not change the world," Kaito continued, "but it changes the eyes with which we see it." Renji slid another bead. The wind didn't seem different, but now he felt it more clearly. Another bead. The sky remained dark, but each star spoke to him with its light. Another bead. His heart no longer asked for anything because he had everything in that very instant. Kaito stood up and looked at his disciple with serenity. "Tomorrow at dawn, you will leave the monastery." Renji looked up, surprised. "Leave? But, Master, if the rosary only serves you in the silence of this temple, you have learned nothing," Kaito said calmly. "Now you must carry this silence with you, even amidst the noise of the world." Renji lowered his gaze to the rosary. He knew that his learning had not yet ended. He slid another bead and breathed deeply. The morning breeze swept through the monastery as the sun began to color the mountains gold. Renji stood at the temple entrance, holding his rosary with reverence. It was the first time he felt he wasn't leaving, but returning to the world. Master Kaito accompanied him to the path descending the mountain. "Renji, what will you do with the rosary now?" he asked with a slight smile. The young man slid a bead between his fingers and replied without hesitation, "I will keep walking with it, not because I need it, but because each bead reminds me that I am already where I am supposed to be." Kaito nodded, satisfied. "Remember this. The rosary is not a chain, but a circle. Each bead is a step, and each step leads you back to yourself." Renji closed his eyes for a moment. He heard the wind between the trees, the murmur of the stream, the distant chanting of the monks in prayer. Everything was calm. Everything was one. When he opened his eyes, he bowed his head with respect, placed the rosary in his tunic, and began walking down the mountain. He didn't know where the path would take him, but it didn't matter anymore. The true journey had already begun. The day slowly passed as Renji descended the path. Every step he took was now part of the same flow, a dance between the wind and the earth, between his being and the world. The rosary remained in his hands, but he no longer felt it as an object separate from him. It was part of his being. In the distance, the voices of the people began to be heard. The bustle of the village approached, but Renji no longer feared the noise. The calm he had experienced in the monastery now extended to his interior. He crossed the village gate and saw the hustle and bustle of daily life. Farmers working, children running, the sound of conversations floating in the air. But in his heart, there was a deep peace. Someone called him from one of the houses. Renji approached and smiled, recognizing the curious gaze of an old friend. "Where have you been all this time?" asked his friend, looking at the rosary in his hands. Renji smiled and, without words, let the silence answer him. "This is the path," he said at last, showing him the rosary. "A path that does not begin nor end. It simply is." The friend looked at him, surprised, and for a moment, Renji saw a spark of understanding in his eyes. Perhaps, deep inside, he too had begun his own journey. Renji kept walking, unhurried. There was no destination, only presence. Each bead sliding between his fingers was a reminder that life, in its complexity, was already enough. And as he moved forward, he knew with certainty that the rosary was no longer just an object of prayer. It was his path, his life, and in each bead, the totality of the universe. The cycle continued, and he was part of it,